It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about his newest book, Teaching with Authority, How to Cut Through Doctrinal Confusion and Understand What the Church Really Says, is Catholic Answers apologist, Jimmy Akin. Thanks for being here, Jimmy.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Kyle.
So, going back to high school, was Jimmy Akin a rule follower or a rule breaker?
A little bit of both.
The idea of your book, Teaching with Authority, what kind of authority are we talking about here?
We're talking about teaching authority. One of the things that the crowds marveled at during Jesus' ministry was the way he taught authoritatively. And he shared that teaching authority with the church. So when the church teaches something today, it isn't just arbitrary, it isn't just something made up. It's something that's backed by the teaching authority of Christ himself. He said, if they hear you, they hear me. If they reject you, they reject me and the one who sent me, meaning you reject God. So it's very important that we accept and understand the church's teachings, and that's why I wrote this book.
And so who all is that extended to? Who all has the authority to be teaching?
Originally, it was extended to the apostles, and then when they passed from the scene, it was given to their successors, the bishops, as the chief shepherds of the church. So today, the bishops teaching in union with the Pope exercise Christ's teaching authority. There's a special word for that. We call the bishops teaching with the Pope the Magisterium. Magister is the Latin word for teacher, and so the church's teaching authority is called the Magisterium.
And it's not just any time that a bishop is speaking that they're speaking with the authority that was given to the apostles. How do we know when it is an authoritative teaching and when it's not?
That's the main subject of the book, how to tell when a teaching is authoritative and when it's not. Sometimes bishops do just say things privately as a matter of their own personal opinion, like when Pope Benedict wrote his Jesus of Nazareth book. He pointed out in the preface to the first volume that this was not an action of the magisterium. It was just his opinion, and so everyone was free to disagree with him, he said. But when a bishop or pope is teaching in an official document and they're dealing with matters of Catholic doctrine, unless they say this is just an opinion, then the implication is, no, this is something you have to take seriously. This is what the church teaches. And sometimes they use very strong language to indicate the level of authority that's invested in a particular teaching.
Are there like a set designated different levels of authority?
There are. It ranges all the way from, at the bottom, just matters of opinion, like I mentioned, to things that are taught authoritatively, but with different degrees of authority. At the high end, you have things that are so authoritative, they've actually been taught infallibly, meaning that they're guaranteed to be true. And within that group of infallible teachings, there are some that the church has infallibly said are divinely revealed. So they're not things we learn some other way. We know these because God himself revealed them to us. And those things, the things that the church has infallibly said are divinely revealed, those things are known as dogmas.
Mm-hmm. And then how would a dogma be different from a doctrine?
Doctrine is the broader term. The Latin word doctrina just means teaching. And so any authoritative teaching, anything that's not just an opinion, any authoritative teaching is a doctrine. And then within doctrines, you have infallible doctrines. And then within the infallible doctrines, you have the dogmas.
Okay. And what about like an encyclical? What would that be considered?
Encyclicals are highly authoritative teaching documents, but they're not the ones that popes use when they're speaking infallibly. So if you find something written in an encyclical, it could be something that's already been defined infallibly, but popes don't use encyclicals to make new infallible definitions. So anything that's, you typically find in an encyclical is authoritative, but not infallible.
We're talking with Jimmy Akin from Catholic Answers, and his new book from Catholic Answers Press is Teaching with Authority. And we're talking about the difference between things that we have to believe and things that we could possibly disagree with. And there's some things that are just good ideas, but not necessarily required, something like the rosary. How do we know if something is required of us as Catholics and something is just optional and maybe a good thing?
Well, the starting point for figuring out what the church says is reading its own documents. So if you're not sure where else to look, the best place to look is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a basic summary of the whole of the Catholic faith. And so if you look in the Catechism, you may find references to the Rosary in there that recommend it and mention it as an example of Marian prayer, especially here in the West. But what you won't find are statements saying this is mandatory for all Catholics. And so unless you have a statement indicating everybody has to do this, then it's something, practices like this are things that are optional that you can do if you feel that it would help you draw closer to God. But if it's not part of your tradition, like for many Eastern Catholics, they have a different Marian prayer called the Akafist hymn that they use, then you're not obliged to use it.
And then getting back to our bishops, when do we know when a bishop is speaking authoritatively?
Well, as I indicated, the key is typically, is it in an official document? If it's something the bishop has published himself and it deals with doctrine, then it's engaging his teaching ministry. It's a little different if he's like speaking to the press. You know, a newspaper account of an interview, for example, is not going to be a case where the bishop is using his teaching authority. But if he's published the document himself, he's had a chance to review it, it deals with doctrine, and especially if he uses key phrases like the church teaches or the faith obliges us to believe or something like that, then you know he's using his teaching authority.
I know some people that were considering converting to Catholicism but would have hang-ups with certain issues. What are the things that Catholics would need to believe before they could come into full communion with the church versus things, again, that might not be necessary for you to be 100% on board with?
The basic dividing line is between things that have been infallibly taught and things that haven't. If something's been infallibly taught, then you really do need to absolutely believe it in order to become Catholic. That doesn't mean you need to feel absolutely confident. As Cardinal John Henry Newman pointed out back in the 1800s, we can feel emotional difficulties with a teaching, but as long as we're able to accept it and say, no, I trust Christ, and so I trust his church, so I accept this, even though I may feel some difficulties with it, then that's enough. But you really need to be able to accept whatever the church has taught infallibly. You also need to accept things that the church teaches authoritatively, but the church does understand that at least with its non-infallible teachings, there can be cases where someone may not feel able to accept it, but that wouldn't stop you from being a Catholic.
You mentioned the Catechism being a great resource for finding out church teaching and things. Would you recommend also going to these other church documents and papal documents for deciphering that, or is that a little bit too difficult for the average person?
Well, it can be difficult for the average person, which is precisely why I wrote the book, because there are a lot of people out there, both in the secular media, but even in the Catholic blogosphere. You know, online, there are a lot of people who are Catholic who are trying to read church documents and trying to apply them, but they don't have the background in reading them that they need to. And so there's a lot of confusion out there. And so that's why I wrote the book. It was to show people the principles that they need to use so that they can read church documents for themselves and understand them and figure them out. It's basically like a book on Bible interpretation. You know, there are lots of books on Bible interpretation, but there are almost none on how to read what the church teaches and understand that. And so that's why I wrote this book, to give you those tools so you can do that for yourself.
You've talked about how people throw the word heresy around a lot as an attack or a rebuttal to somebody's comment or to something, even maybe something the Pope has said or something. Do you think that is being misused?
Oh, absolutely. The term heresy is something you should never use, because it's a huge insult, and it can really damage someone's reputation. It can really stir up a lot of trouble. You should never use the word heresy unless Number one, you know what the word heresy actually means, which most people don't.
Sounds like
and,
fair.
and number two, you verified that the conditions for heresy actually are fulfilled in a particular case. Otherwise, you're just being reckless and damaging someone else's reputation and committing the sin of detraction. So it's very important not to do that. What a heresy is, it's something, number one, you have to be baptized. You have to be a professing Christian in order to be able to commit a heresy. Number two, someone has had to try to seriously correct you and say, hey, you're teaching an error here, and you say, I don't care, I'm teaching this anyway. So you have to be obstinate. And then the third thing is you have to reject a dogma. It is not enough to reject just a church teaching. It's not even enough to reject an infallible teaching. You have to be rejecting a dogma specifically in order to commit a heresy.
Can you give an example?
Yeah. For example, the dogma of the Immaculate Conception is one of the dogmas of the church. And so if someone said, yeah, I know the church teaches that, and yeah, my bishop told me I really seriously need to believe that, but I just don't care, I'm going to reject the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Well, if you did that, then that would be a heresy.
Sure. What is something that people mistakenly attribute to being on the level of dogma that isn't actually a teaching of the Catholic Church?
Well, that I'm not sure I can give you an example of. What I can give you an example of is something that is a church teaching and is even an infallible church teaching, but isn't a dogma, at least at this point. One of the things that St. John Paul II confirmed back in the 1990s is that the church had already infallibly taught that it doesn't have the ability to confer the priesthood on people who are not baptized men. So the idea of women's ordination has already, he said, been infallibly rejected by the church. But he didn't go on to say that the church had infallibly said that's divinely revealed. And so that would be an example of an infallible teaching that at this point is not a dogma. In the future, this is something Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict, said, in the future, the church's consciousness could progress to the point where the church says, yeah, that's divinely revealed. That's not something we know another way, but that's actually divinely revealed. And at that point, it could become a dogma, but it's not one yet. Right now, it's just an infallible teaching.
And since it's an infallible teaching, it couldn't change in the future to be...
That's correct.
Found to be false. Okay.
That's correct. It's guaranteed to be true.
All right. Well, so much more to learn. This is a thick book. People should check it out. It's Teaching with Authority from Jimmy Akin. Where can people get a copy of it?
People can get it at Amazon.com. It's available in paperback and also in Kindle, so you can download it in just moments. You can even have your Kindle device read it out loud to you if you're like me and you like audiobooks. You can also get it at shop.catholic.com, or you can get it from your local Catholic bookstore.
All right. Again, it's Teaching with Authority, How to Cut Through Doctrinal Confusion and Understand What the Church Really Says from Jimmy Akin. Thank you so much, Jimmy, for joining us today and filling us in on this. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.